Louis C.K., R. Kelly, Harvey Weinstein, Bill Cosby. These are names you may recognize for a lot of reasons, but collectively, they reflect the height of the Me Too movement. The movement was a social media uprising started in 2017, but originally kicked off in 2006. It was meant to bring awareness against sexual abuse, harassment, and rape culture. The survivors, usually women and especially public figures, shared their experiences using the hashtag #MeToo. And while nearly everyone can agree that the concept of mutual consent is a good one, the real-life scenarios have left many unsure of how to act. My next guest is an Emmy-nominated reproductive health and justice reporter at The Guardian, who recently interviewed over 100 people under 30. The topic? Their sex lives. Conversations of consent, porn, and sexlessness fill her new book, The Second Coming. Today, she's going to share how the findings of both the public data and private conversations played out as we ask the question, was the Me Too movement a positive step forward or a confusing step sideways? This is the Curious Introvert podcast with me, Meredith. Around here, we explore taboo questions and societal blind spots. My mission, and yours if you choose to accept it, is to inspire curiosity by exploring the nuance and paradox of our world. Please help me welcome debuting author, newlywed, and proud cat mom, Carter Sherman. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I have to tell you something very related to this topic happened to me last week. I was doing a pre-production video chat, a lot like the one we did, with a gentleman who was going to come on the show. He said he was a psychotherapist. He has kind of this cool self-help thing going on. And in the first 5 minutes, he was inappropriate. And he used the word thrust and then kind of winked at me. Yeah, multiple times. And then, and yeah, exactly. And I was like, okay. And, sometimes when people are nervous, they act weird. And he was in his 60s. So I was giving him grace, okay, he's nervous and, not really up to date on how to behave on a video chat. But then he used a masturbating hand gesture. Yeah, girl. And I was
5 minutes of meeting him?
In the 30-minute conversation that we had, yeah.
Regardless of the time limit, I guess I should specify, but that is, the generous interpretation is bold, I would say.
Well, I always try to offer grace. He's older, he's awkward. But after the masturbating hand gesture happened, I started to feel what has happened to me in the past in scenarios like this, where I have a freeze response. My body is continuing in whatever behavior is socially appropriate. I'm continuing the call. I'm being professional. I'm staying focused on our little agenda that we have. But I'm kind of leaving my body just a tiny bit. And so we hung up the call and I thought about it and I thought, well, this is not safe. If he can't act right in 30 minutes, what if my listeners engage in one of his self-help programs and he's inappropriate with them? So I canceled the podcast episode. And as you can imagine, he was thrilled. So that is story number one.
Okay.
Story number two happened to a friend of mine a couple of years ago. Now, he's the complete opposite of this older man. He is in his 30s. I would consider him pretty progressive in his ideas. I would even call him a feminist. He was talking with a woman on a dating app. She messaged him. She wanted to come over and hook up. He checked okay, are you sure? You good? She said yes. She came over to his apartment, opened the door. He asked for consent again. Then they went to the bedroom and he checked in with her again and everything was good. 2 weeks later, she messages him and says, that really wasn't cool what you did. And he was like, I'm sorry, did you mean to send this to me? What's happening here? And lawyers got involved. And it was a really stressful time for him because he's like, I purposely checked in with her. So 2 very different stories here. But in my mind, shouldn't have the Me Too movement prevented both of these scenarios?
I think that is a lot to ask of the Me Too movement. I think it would be really lovely if it were possible to have sort of a spurt of collective consciousness raising about what sexual harassment looks like, about what sexual assault looks like, and for then all of us to mutually agree that this is how we're all going to conduct our sex lives, this is how we're all going to conduct ourselves at work. and then all of us uphold those standards. It's just not possible for something like the Me Too movement to really solve all of the things that we were asking for it to solve. That said, I do think it does leave a lot of older people, in particular, people yours and my age, I'm in my 30s, with a better sense of what sexual assault and sexual harassment are. Me Too movement did not necessarily leave us with a lot of guidelines for how to handle what goes wrong when things go wrong.
So what did the Me Too movement leave us with if it didn't leave us with a playbook for better behavior?
I think that was one of the questions I was really trying to answer in my book, because the Me Too movement for me was a transformative moment. I think it really led me to recontextualize, reevaluate a lot of my own experiences. And I know so many other women also felt that way. When the Me Too movement happened, we suddenly realized, oh, maybe this thing that we thought was off or weird was actually wrong. And actually, maybe we deserve to be treated better and we're going to demand better moving forward. But however many years we are on now, it's not really clear what the legacy of the Me Too movement really was. I mean, if you look at many of the people, frankly, in power in this country, it doesn't really seem like allegations of sexual harassment or sexual assault mean very much. It doesn't seem to have stopped those people from reaching incredible heights of power in this country. And so I wanted to, through the conversations I was having with young people, ask them what they thought the Me Too movement had done, what it had changed in their lives, how it had changed the way that they approach sex. And what I found was, particularly for young women, they remembered the Me Too movement. They thought it was a pivotal moment in their sex lives, but it didn't actually make them feel safer. Because what the Me Too movement really did not do is it didn't change policy. The main things that came out of the Me Too movement when it comes to policy changes were improved or arguably just different rules around NDAs and more HR trainings around sexual harassment and assault. And if you're a young person who's working, those things don't really help you. And so they did not see the kind of institutional change that would lead them to have the tools or the resources they need to address things when they go wrong. And so for a lot of these young women, it just made them feel like, oh, sexual harassment, sexual assault is everywhere, because it is. They had an accurate assessment of that. But there's nothing that I can do if someone harasses or assaults me. And that just creates a miasma of fear and anxiety that is really not conducive to feeling healthy and safe.
Do you think it's possible that it created fear across the spectrum, like the women realizing that such a widespread and visible social movement had no impact on their safety or their, being able to report things that are inappropriate? And then also men feeling like my friend, like even if they do the steps that they're supposed to do, that they can still be on the receiving end of allegations.
So I have a lot of thoughts on this. And I don't want to comment specifically on, the situation that your friend found himself in, because obviously I don't know the specifics.
Yeah.
But what I will say is a couple of things. Number one, we know that false accusations of sexual assault were and remain extraordinarily rare. Men are much more likely to be sexually assaulted than they are to be falsely accused of sexual assault. And in my interviews with young women, actually in my interviews with everybody, I did not ask people if they had been sexually assaulted. That was not a question that I baked into the questionnaire that I gave everybody or asked everybody. But it really came up a lot just when I was talking to young women. I would say the vast majority of them had been sexually violated in some way. And then when I was interviewing young men, only one young person actually in the entirety of my interview said that they had ever crossed the line sexually with somebody and that they had done something that they knew was wrong and they felt bad about it. And we had a long conversation about, what that looked like and what that meant for them. But it is interesting that if in all of my conversations with young women, so many of them have been assaulted, but in so many of my conversations with young men, none of them have done anything that's wrong. And I'm not accusing any of those men that I interviewed of doing anything wrong. I mean, chances are they didn't. But it's interesting because it's always, for me, raises this question of like, okay, well then who is sexually assaulting these young women? What is going on here? And the third thing I would add here is that there was a very interesting study that was done actually prior to Me Too about cues that young college men use to ascertain consent. And so in this study by a scholar named Nicole Badera, which I really recommend her work, it's very incisive, she asked young men to describe what they thought good indicators of consent were in general. And they could all say, you know, a comprehensive conversation, we should definitely talk about things, I should definitely get verbal consent. But then when she asked young men to describe the signals that they had used in their most recent sexual encounter, which is a different question, do you want to guess what one of the top signals was?
She looked at me.
Yeah, it was eye contact. That's what it was.
Yeah.
And Nicole had one of the guys like do it to her. Like she was like, show me the kind of eye contact that indicates consent. And she was like, reader, I could not tell the difference between that and normal eye contact. So I think that like a lot of young men, they're not scared of the Me Too movement or worried about the Me Too movement, I found, because they felt like they were the kind of guys who would never do something like that. And they were like, I do ask for consent and I do, you know, have these conversations with my partners. And again, I have nothing to say that none of these men were like exactly as they portrayed themselves to be. I have no belief whatsoever that they had sexually assaulted, harassed anybody. But I think young men oftentimes think, oh, I would never do that. And therefore, they actually weren't that worried about the Me Too movement because they were like, well, I would just simply never find myself in the situation where that could happen to me, or I would have done something wrong. And the fact of the matter is, it's like, well, probably a lot of men are doing things wrong. They just don't know.
Mm. Yeah, that's
and
interesting.
I should say, also young men do get sexually assaulted too.
Yes.
1 in 9 men have been made to penetrate somebody against their will, and 1 in 25 have been penetrated against their will. And those circumstances also constitute rape.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's definitely less talked about.
Yes.
For sure.
And it is more common among women. Yeah, 1 in 4 women have been sexually assaulted in some way.
Yeah. I wonder if in your research that you've come across incidents of women who are the kind of women that we don't like to meet, you know, the kind of women that really hurt the cause, if you will, because I know they're out there. In my research for our conversation, I was talking to a friend of mine who works kind of in the biz, if you will, the industry of television. She unfortunately knew quite a few women that used the Me Too movement as a way to clear their conscience in regrettable sex that they had had in the past. And I think that's where the waters can get really muddy. But it sounds like in your conversations, you had just like this lovely sampling of people who, you know, were do-gooders. Had you accidentally come across anybody that sounded similar to the women that I'm referring to?
No, I didn't encounter anybody like that. I mean, I'm sure, you know, people are out there, but again, it's very uncommon for a woman to lodge a false complaint of sexual assault. I mean, just think about the amount of work that it takes to do that. Like the HR components, getting lawyers involved, that's expensive. Getting the law involved, that's very difficult. It's grindingly upsetting for many people. A lot of people think about, after being sexually assaulted, getting the police involved is like a second violation because of how dehumanizing that process is. And so I think it is very unlikely for women to do that. I'm not surprised that in my sample, I didn't encounter anybody who thought that way or felt that way or had done anything like that.
Well, certainly as women, we would hope that no one would do that because it hurts all of us when circumstances are even just exaggerated, much less completely manufactured. And I can tell you that at the height of the Me Too movement, I was working a lot as a commercial model on sets that were for like tourism and resorts. So I often had a fake husband. And something that it helped me kind of put into focus is how I treat those men on set and how they are treated by other men on set. We were on the balcony of this one shoot and my fake husband was there, the crew was there. My fake husband was sitting and the crew members were like, okay, now go ahead and just sit on his lap. And because of the Me Too movement, I was like, no one's asking him Like they were real sweet with me and like, okay, is this okay? What about this? But no one asked him. And so I kind of like leaned over. I was like, is that cool? Like, if it's not cool, it's okay. Like, I'll tell
Yeah.
him to have a different plan. And he's like, no, it's okay. And so then I, sat on his lap. But it's like, okay, well, my boob's kind of in his face and I'm on his lap. And like, this is definitely something that we should think about. How else do you find, from your perspective, men have benefited from the Me Too movement?
I kind of wish that they had benefited more, to be honest with you. I wish that we had more conversations about the ways that men can be assumed to be particular kinds of ways, particularly when it comes to sex. So one of the concepts that I spent a lot of time unearthing in my book is this idea of quote unquote hegemonic masculinity. And it's basically this idea used in sociology that says that the stereotypes of a man are that a man is big and strong, he is caveman-like, he's emotionless. Oh, and by the way, he always wants sex. Basically, these are the traditional narratives that we have around masculinity that say that men should always want sex and men should be good at obtaining sex. And I think that stereotype really hurts men. I think that it makes them feel like they can't speak up when something does go wrong. And they can't say, oh, I felt uncomfortable in this sexual scenario, because they're thinking, I'm expected to always want sex. And maybe they don't even realize that it's okay for them to not always want sex because, they're people too. They have complex emotions, complex feelings. And I wish that we had been able to have more of a conversation about not necessarily decentering the extent to which women do make up the majority of sexual harassment and sexual assault victims. But I wish we had been able to talk more about what is the gendered hierarchy and the gendered stereotypes that lead this scenario to exist in the first place. And how is this harming everybody involved? Because when we build these ideas around who should be in charge based on stereotypes, we are dehumanizing people. We are making them less than. We're not granting them the full breadth of their personality and humanity. And I think it would be beneficial to everybody if we were able to acknowledge, hey, individuals are individuals, and we should allow them to have autonomy in these situations, not just assume they're going to be some kind of way.
You would hope it to be like an all boats rise kind of scenario.
That's a much more succinct way of putting what I just said.
No. Yeah, I love the way that you put it. It was wonderful. Because I don't know if it's like an internet side effect or what, but when we have stuff like this happen, there's this thing where we try to diagnose other people. We try to diagnose scenarios that happened 10 years ago. We try to look at public figures and label them, label situations. It's like we go into true crime mode. And the better output, I think, would be to self-evaluate. How can I level up my own behavior to be respectful and kind to other people? But for some reason, that is not our default.
I mean, I think people really struggle to think that they were in the wrong. And they really struggle to think that, oh, maybe I did do something that was really hurtful to another person. And people push away that possibility. And I do think that there was a lot of language that came out around the Me Too movement that talked about like, oh, well, good men don't do this. Like, if you're just a good man, you will never be accused. And the thing that I think is actually kind of important to keep in mind is like, everybody is nuanced. And if we say like only bad men do this sexual assault thing, then people who think of themselves as good men are never going to be able to consider, oh, maybe I did something bad. That doesn't make me a bad person necessarily, but I did something bad, because they're just going to have a knee-jerk reaction of pushing that possibility away. It's hard because, yes, Me Too was very much an internet-born phenomenon, and like tweets do not really lend themselves to nuance or complexity or empathy.
No.
But it would have been, I think, better if we were able to hold space for that, to use sort of a very wellnessy term, but just like hold space for the fact that like, oh, maybe you did something wrong, but actually there's a way to come back from that. And you have to do the work to figure that out.
That's where I think people struggle, is they see these labels as very permanent. You can dye your hair, but you're still a brunette. You're a pervert, and you're always going to be a pervert. And there's not a lot of, speaking of the internet, not a lot of examples of forgiveness. One YouTube commenter on a video about this topic asked, what is the point of these folks asking for public forgiveness if no forgiveness is given? And I thought, wow, that's actually a very good question. And it may contribute to people shying away from being introspective about their own behavior, because if they find themselves in fault, they may see it as a lifelong sentence.
Yeah, but it really didn't turn out to be a lifelong sentence for many people, right? Like if we look at the number of people who were quote unquote canceled after the Me Too movement, not a lot of them really were pushed out of public life in a real way.
And you know that because you're an amazing journalist and you love nuance. But like, think about like the average 50, 60-year-old man who reads headlines only, who doesn't follow up. Oh, remember that headline from a year and a half ago? I wonder how Louis C.K.'s doing now. Let me go look that up. Like, they're not
selling out venues, I'll tell you that. Yeah.
Well, they don't know that. All they remember is a man in my age demographic got canceled and his life was ruined. Like, the info stops there. You know what I mean? So the perception is that it is permanent.
Yes. And on some level, I can't help you if you don't read. You know what I mean? Like, you have to be willing to do some work. Because it's not that hard to Google some of these people and find out what's going on.
Yeah.
So there has to be like a baseline level of willingness to engage here. I understand like the fear of being canceled and how devastating it can feel, like the internet is piling on you. Like I'm a woman in public, so I have had the internet pile on me many times, and it does feel very crushing. And those are situations where I don't think I did do anything wrong. And so I can't imagine when a circumstance when it's like, oh, I think I might have done something wrong. And then also the world is telling me that I'm done something wrong. Now I feel terrible. But I think sometimes we just have to accept that if you do something wrong, maybe you deserve to feel terrible about it for a little bit. Like, there are consequences that happen as a result of behaviors. And, you know, the thing is that right now, the consequences for a lot of sexual harassment and assault, those are placed on the victims. And it's the victims who have to live with the consequences of that. I think a lot about the fact that sexual assault is one of the number one reasons why women leave college campuses, like why they drop out of school. And what happens when women leave school? Well, they can't flourish in the same way. They can't flourish economically. They can't participate in public life in the same way because they're not able to fulfill their full potential. Mm-hmm. And then we end up in a society where women as a group have less power. And so I do think it's important to keep in mind, again, that this is a systemic issue that contributes to inequalities across the board. And just because you might be afraid of the consequences of one of your actions doesn't mean that there are no consequences. The consequences are being borne out by somebody.
Hey, quick question. You seem like you're enjoying this episode so far, but have you hit the follow button on your podcast player? Take a second to follow the show so you never miss an episode. Okay, back to the interview. When you were interviewing those young people about their dating habits, how has the Me Too movement impacted their habits and rituals around love and sex and all of that?
Well, they are much more aware of sexual harassment and sexual assault. And I will say that I was incredibly impressed by many of the young women who I interviewed who had realized, I think at an age much earlier than I did, that if something had gone wrong in their lives, that thing might be sexual harassment or assault, and that they deserved accountability for that. You know, when I was in high school, there was someone who was widely thought to be harassing and assaulting people. And we just thought, okay, like there's nothing to be done about that. And we didn't go to adults. We didn't go to school administrators. We certainly didn't go to the police. It didn't even really cross our minds to do any of those things. And the young women I interviewed thought about institutions, and they thought, okay, can I go out and demand better? One of the people who I followed a lot over a course of several years, because I did reporting on these young women for my day job. I was working at the time at Vice News before I came to The Guardian, and also for the book, was this group of young women who became activists in North Carolina. And they attended a school district that had been rocked not only by allegations of sexual assault, but by allegations that when these young women tried to report, they were silenced by school administrators and specifically threatened with suspension. Mm. And there's a lot of details in that like particular scenario, and the administrators have by and large denied wrongdoing. But what I was really struck by when I was following these young women around is the fact that they became activists over this. They went to school board meetings and they held rallies and they demanded better from their community. And it was at an immense personal cost, frankly. It was very difficult for them to do this. But the fact that I think young women in particular, and increasingly young men, are connecting the personal and the political. Like they are thinking about, okay, if this happened to me, maybe there's actually some kind of political valence that's going on here that I can affect change in my community and make it better for the next person.
You said that there was no legislative change from the Me Too movement. If you
Very
were
little, yeah.
Very little. If you were to wave a magic,
very concentrated in the realms of NDAs and HR.
Yeah, that is strange. That it seems like more protection for the people who would potentially be the perpetrator.
Well, I think the idea with, like HR training is to avert it before it happens. The idea with the NDAs is that it basically, speaking very broadly about the legislation that passed in many state legislatures, is that you weren't really able to silence people in the same way through the use of NDAs. And so the idea was that more things would come out into the public. I think that the interesting thing for me, and I think one of the fundamental questions of the Me Too movement that all of this legislation brings up is the question of, was the Me Too movement about sex or was it about work? Because the remedies that came out of it, to the extent that remedies did come out of it, those focused on work. They did not focus on sex and dating and intimate relationships that take place outside of the context of the workplace.
So what legislation do we need?
Oh, that's a big question.
I know.
Think that there
I know it is.
And I do think that there is room for, cultural awareness, rethinking of the kind that the Me Too movement much more so focused on. I don't have like the laundry list of legislation that I think would improve the state of sexual harassment and sexual assault to the point that we don't have to deal with it. I think that there are a lot of advocates who've done a lot of really great work putting together policy lists that they would like to see. But I do think that we need to cement this stuff into policy if we want to see it continue. Because a lot of people don't think about policy, right? You don't think about legislation. You don't think about litigation. To your point about, the 50-year-old man who just saw the headlines, like these are not people who are generally reading, as I do, this sort of like point-by-point campus manual about how to handle a sexual assault. And that's fine. That's fair. But I think that when you add stuff into policy, you can avoid the need for that because then the policy sort of creates the scaffolding for change and it makes it more permanent and it changes the way that people encounter these things in their real lives, even if they don't understand that they're being influenced by policy. So I think that there is no way to really address the Me Too movement and its aims without having policy be a piece of that.
Do you have one piece of policy that if you could wave? Well, I'm asking this because, I think what I'm trying to overcome is the ear of the listener that's like, well, what are we going to do?
Sure.
And
I do have an idea. Okay. And I'm not saying that this is perfect as is, but are you familiar with Title IX?
No, tell me all about it.
Okay, so Title IX, I think a lot of people know it in the context of sports, but it is basically a 1972 civil rights law that protects against sex discrimination in education. And so basically the idea is that under Title IX, if you are in an educational environment that is rife with sexual harassment or assault, that is inhibiting your ability to get an education, and it is gender discrimination, sex discrimination. And the thing is that we talk about Title IX a lot, or at least we have in the past, at the level of colleges. And there was a lot of infighting, as I detail in my book, over how Title IX should be enforced during the Obama era and especially during the first Trump administration, and then a bit during the Biden administration as well. And so there's been a lot of changes between administrations over how to enforce Title IX. But the thing that I would posit is regardless of how it is enforced, we should be thinking a lot more about Title IX at the K through 12 grade level. And we should be looking at what we're saying to younger people, the people who are just coming up in the world, just starting to understand that sexual assault and harassment even exists, about how institutions like schools handle it. Because Title IX should be enforced at the K through 12 grade level. That is the law. But a lot of schools are not living up to those promises. And they are not actually having staffed Title IX offices. They do not have well-trained Title IX coordinators. And it creates this idea that sexual harassment and sexual assault is a rite of passage, particularly for young women. I think every young woman I know, and I include myself in this, grew up and had some kind of early formative experience where they were treated poorly because of their gender, and there was like sexual overtones towards it. And there was they didn't even think to go to their schools, as I was saying earlier. And so I think we need to create a culture where we understand that this is something that schools are responsible for handling, and schools should have the resources to handle it.
That would be a really great place to start. I really like that. I also wonder if, you know how when you want market change, you have to create market signals, like you vote with your dollars, that sort of thing. I wonder if there's an opportunity here for just, people to tomorrow just act differently. And I think this is where a lot of the next steps become a little confusing or unsure, is like, where do people go to learn this? Because as you detailed so beautifully in your book, the sex ed situation in the US is not so great. And it does not include consent. And certainly I can tell you my sex ed did not include any consent. It was mostly like scary videos of STDs and stuff like that. And
but it's all very Mean Girls, if you have sex, you will die sort of vibes in American sex ed. That's for sure.
Yeah. So from a practical standpoint, let's start with young people, since you talked with them a lot. Like, how can young people become more aware of their behavior so that everyone feels good and we can laugh and flirt and, not just avoid dating as some are doing, while also evolving as a society in the area of mutual respect?
I will say that I am not a parent, so caveat on this, but I was struck by the number of young people who had never had conversations with their parents about sex and sexual assault and all of the nuances and, icky small topics that might flow from those two things. And I found that really striking because I grew up in a family where we were able to have those conversations. I just opened the book with this anecdote that I shared a lot, but when I was 17, had a full-on breakdown in front of my mom because I hadn't had sex yet. And I thought I was the last 17-year-old virgin on the planet. And I've shared that anecdote with people, and they have been like, I cannot believe you spoke to your mom about that. And, my parents really created an avenue for me to feel comfortable speaking my mind and my feelings about things, including sex. And so I do think that, I know it is scary for parents to have these conversations, but I do think that it is critical to create the space for young people to approach their parents about these issues, especially when something goes wrong in sex, because it can just feel so suffocating and isolating for these young people to feel like you cannot say something to your parents and that you have to keep this secret from your parents. I would also say that a lot of sex ed policy, even though it is very dramatically influenced by the federal government, because the federal government pours a lot of money into sex ed, but a lot of sex ed policy is actually set at the state and local level. And so if you feel like the sex ed that is going on in your community is not something you support, you can actually go to your local school board and talk to them about it. And I think we have all seen the videos of very raucous school board meetings over the last few years. Like, they're available to talk. And I feel like if you are someone who is sane and normal and willing to have a real conversation, they're going to be willing to hear you because they're dealing with a lot of other people who are operating in a very high decibel level.
That was so delicately put.
Thank you. I watched a lot of those videos and I've been in school board meetings for reporting, and I can tell you that they become unhinged at a rapid clip.
So I grew up with like parents not really talking about sex, that sort of thing. And I think a lot of people my age did. Now, I'm 42, so I think just like 10 years younger, maybe even just 5 years younger, they had a different experience. A lot of my friends who are younger than I am had these wonderfully open conversations that were ongoing. It wasn't like one and done, a lot like what you described with your parents. And so for a while there, I had this hope that, okay, these are the parents. They're going to change everything. And we're going to have young people who understand consent and have fantastic social skills. And so I thought, okay, this is the generation that changes it all. They're going to just know how to do all of it. And then the sex recession happened. And I'm like, oh no, we're going backwards. We are going backwards. So a 2022 survey conducted in part by Kinsey Institute said 1 in 4 Gen Z adults who are like young adults said they'd never experienced partnered sex. Is that confusion and fear from the whole Me Too movement?
I think it is inextricable from it. So the sex recession actually began a little earlier than I think a lot of people really realize. I'm a millennial, I'm 31, and it actually started amongst my generation. So when I was in high school, the number of people who had had sex in high school dropped to below 50%. And so we start to see a decline between millennials and Gen Z to the point where today only about a third of high school students have had sex. And so that is a big drop, but it means that if we're trying to find the roots of the sex recession, we can't pin it on something that happened in 2017 because sex was already on the decline amongst young people prior to the Me Too movement breaking out. So that said, I do think it is hard to take away what happened in the Me Too movement from what happened with the sex recession. And I don't think that is necessarily because Me Too made people afraid to date. As I said, in particular, I think young men are oftentimes not really that worried about the Me Too movement because they feel like they're not the type to do these things, and many of them are not. But I do think that the politicization of sex, which has always been the case, sex has always been extraordinarily political. But I think the visibility of that politicization at this moment has made people much more anxious around sex and frankly, just much more anxious in life. Like if you look at the number of things that Gen Z has gone through over the last few years, you have not only the Me Too movement, but also the overturning of Roe v. Wade. You have the pandemic. You have the Trump administration, which regardless of your opinions on it, is undeniably very turbulent. And so I think the constant beating of politics in people's brains has made it difficult for them to relax and enjoy life. And I think that that is unfortunately kind of the wrong way to think about sex. Like, as I said, sex has always been political. And I think we actually need to accept that about sex and accept that the person was political. And then that will actually help us be able to have fulfilling romantic and sexual lives, even in the midst of all of this political turmoil that is going on. Because I don't see the political turmoil stopping anytime soon. So I think we need to figure out how to live with it.
How would you suggest that the older generation, people in their 50s, 60s, 70s, how would you suggest that they recalibrate to get up to speed on, okay, these are the old rules and here are the new rules?
I mean, I guess what I'm saying is I don't really know how much the rules have really changed. I think people have this idea that the rules have really changed. But again, because policy hasn't really adapted to become updated with norms that we might have around the Me Too movement, I don't know that there are new rules. And also, again, look at the people who are in power in this country at this moment. It does not seem like an accusation of sexual assault is necessarily going to stop you on what you want to do in life. That said, I assume you're talking about people who like earnestly don't want to sexually assault people.
Yeah.
And so they're really trying to be cognizant of these feelings. And I do think that like you cannot overstate the importance of just having open conversation and communication. Like that's all you can really do at the end of the day is you can continue to have real conversations about what people's boundaries are, what consent looks like for them, what they feel comfortable doing in a particular moment. And I think people want it to be more complex than that because it seems too simple, but it is basic. You just have to be willing to have these conversations with one another. And I think like a fear of embarrassment or risk or rejection keeps a lot of people from being able to have these open conversations.
And simple doesn't equal easy. I mean, when you
No.
ask a 60-year-old man, I'm imagining telling him to articulate with a really high level of emotional intelligence, that is simple but not easy. So
It's hard to be vulnerable.
it's
You know,
it's hard to have feeling
yeah.
words and like organize them in a way that's coherent. So basically what I'm hearing you say is they should go to therapy, get some skills, come back.
I would always recommend therapy. Big advocate of therapy, I have to say.
Yeah.
And like,
Well, there's
you'll
nothing
feel
wrong with that.
better. You know, I
Yeah.
truly believe the sex itself will be better.
Oh,
if you
good
were
point.
able
Good
to
point.
have conversations like this. Like, you know, not all sex is created equal. And so
Yeah.
having sex where you are willing to be vulnerable,
Mhm.
that is better sex. Like, because in my opinion, the best sex is when you have it with someone who is like flexible in body and mind. And so you have to be able to do that and to be
Yeah.
open about that flexibility and be open-minded and have a sense of humor. And
Yeah.
again, be vulnerable and communicative.
Yeah, that's intimacy. Absolutely.
Exactly.
And that connection, human to human, builds happy relationships, which eventually builds happy households, neighborhoods, cities, states. And that's how we get there, I think. Thank you so much for this conversation. Do you have any final thoughts before we close?
This is maybe esoteric, woo-woo.
Oh, that's my favorite. Let's do it.
Okay, I'll bring it in. On the politicization of sex, I think people actually understand this more intrinsically than they realize, because we tend to think about sex as being like a parenthetical experience in our lives. Like, we come home and from work and it might have been difficult and we still have all these things we need to do, but like, let's have sex with our partner and it's going to be like a break from everything else. But I think we all know that if you had a bad day at work or if you've got a lot to do later on, like, the sex is not as good because you are probably distracted from it. So like, we are always already bringing what's going on outside the bedroom into the bedroom. And it does already affect the ways that we are able to have intimate connections with one another. And so I think if we just take the parenthetical feelings off, take those parentheses off and recognize that sex is an integrated part of our lives, and it's integrated with politics, and it's integrated with power, then we can have better sex and be able to have the conversations that also make that sex more consensual and more equal.
Well said. Thank you again. It was so nice meeting you and chatting with you. I highly recommend your book, The Second Coming. It is available on Amazon. I'll have it linked. Is there any other resources that you want to shout out, socials, before we log off?
You can find me on Instagram at Hey Ms. Carter, which, yes, is a Beyonce reference. And I am under my own name on Blue Sky.
Perfect. Thank you a ton. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you've made it this far, I'd like to invite you to be a part of my private Facebook group. In there, I post content that I don't share anywhere else. You can talk to me directly about past and future episodes, and I even do occasional giveaways. Search MFR Curious Insiders on Facebook or click the link in the show notes. Hope to see you in there. And if you liked this episode, you'll also like the one with the mental health counselor asking if trigger warnings are protecting us or just making us weaker. That's episode 208. Stay tuned next week when I talk with an author asking if a 4-day work week is on the horizon for all of us. Until then, keep it curious.